Beyond the neon horizon lies a place where the past and the future finally meet in a burst of light and color. Join our journey into the unknown as we explore the stories of those who dared to cross the line. Click subscribe now and follow us toward the next big revelation. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there in my son-in-law's garage, holding a single piece of paper, and I felt the floor shift beneath 63 years of a life I thought I understood. That paper changed everything, and before I tell you what was on it, I need you to understand who I was before that Sunday afternoon in October, because the man I was before and the man I became after are two very different people. My name is Gerald. I live in Sudbury, Ontario, in the same house I bought with my wife, Patricia, 31 years ago. It's a modest place on Lorne Street, 2 stories, red brick, a covered porch where Patricia used to drink her tea every morning from May to September without fail. She passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I still make 2 cups of tea every morning out of habit. I drink both of them now, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard she loved. I retired from the Ministry of Natural Resources 6 years ago, after 32 years of work that took me all over northern Ontario, from Timmins down to Parry Sound, from Chapleau to the Manitoba border. I know this land the way some men know Scripture. I raised my daughter Renee largely on my own after Patricia's first health scare in 2011 kept her off her feet for almost a year. I coached Renee's soccer team when she was 11. I drove her to university in Kingston with a truck full of IKEA boxes and cried the whole way home on the 401. I was there when she graduated. I was the one who walked her down the aisle. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I was not a man who missed things. 32 years in natural resources management means you learn to read a landscape, to notice when something is out of place, a tree that shouldn't be dying, a water table that has shifted, a road that has no reason to exist. You learn that the land tells you the truth, even when the people standing on it don't. I should have applied that same attention to my own family. My daughter met Daniel at a conference in Toronto 6 years ago. He worked in commercial real estate acquisitions, he always said, with that particular emphasis people use when they want the word to sound more impressive than it is. He was pleasant enough when they were dating, attentive to Renee, polite to me, the kind of man who always picks up the check at dinner and makes sure everyone notices him doing it. Patricia had met him once, briefly, at a Christmas gathering the year before she passed. She pulled me aside in the kitchen that evening and said, very quietly, "He asks a lot of questions about the house, Gerald." I told her she was being unfair. I told her she was tired. I think about that conversation more than I can say. They married 3 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake. Renee looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful. I danced with her to a song Patricia had loved, and I held it together until I got to the parking lot. Daniel shook my hand at the end of the night with both of his hands wrapped around mine, the way politicians do, and said, "She's in good hands, Gerald. I promise." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After the wedding, things shifted in ways that were slow enough that I didn't see them for what they were. Renee called less. When she did call, the conversations were shorter. Somehow supervised, I could always sense Daniel somewhere nearby, not saying anything, just present. She stopped coming for Sunday dinners the way she used to. When I drove down to their place in Barrie, I started noticing that Daniel would guide me away from certain rooms, certain topics, the mortgage refinancing they'd done, the investment accounts, a trip they'd taken to Vancouver that they hadn't mentioned until after the fact. I told myself it was just the natural adjustment of a married couple finding their rhythm. I told myself I was being a difficult father-in-law, the kind who doesn't know how to let go. I am 63 years old, and I live alone in Sudbury, and my daughter is the only family I have left. I knew I was at risk of clinging. I made a conscious effort to give them space. But the thing about being trained to read a landscape is that eventually, even when you are actively looking away, something catches in your peripheral vision and won't let go. It started with the will. Patricia and I had updated our wills in 2019, before she passed. Everything was straightforward. The house and our savings went to Renee, with a small bequest to Patricia's sister in Vancouver, and a donation to the Sudbury Food Bank. After Patricia died, I updated mine again. The house, my pension, my RRSPs, my savings all to Renee. My lawyer, a woman named Helen Chartrand, who has handled my affairs for 20 years, drew up the documents, and I signed them without much thought. There was no one else. There didn't need to be. What I didn't know, until that Sunday in October, was that Daniel had been researching my estate for over a year. I found out by accident, the way most important things are found out. I had driven down to Barrie for what was meant to be a simple visit. Renee had asked me to help her move some boxes from the garage into the basement, old things from university she wanted to sort through. Daniel was supposed to be out at a client meeting, but his car was still in the driveway when I arrived. Renee met me at the door looking tired in a way I hadn't seen before, a particular exhaustion that lived behind her eyes rather than on her face. She said Daniel had come home early and that he was on a call upstairs and would be down shortly. She went into the kitchen to put on coffee. I went into the garage to get started on the boxes. The garage was organized the way Daniel organized everything, a place for every object, labeled and sorted with a precision that always felt slightly aggressive to me. The boxes Renee had mentioned were along the back wall. I was moving the second one when I knocked a file folder off the metal shelving unit to my left. It hit the concrete floor and fanned open, and several pages slid out across the ground. I bent down to gather them. I was not trying to read them. I want to be clear about that. But you cannot pick up a piece of paper without your eyes landing on it, and the first thing my eyes landed on was my name, and then my address, and then the words assessed value and estate liquidity timeline, and a number that made me go very still. I stood up slowly with those pages in my hand. I am not a man who panics. I read the way I have always read a report at work. Start at the top. Take in the information. Understand what you are looking at before you decide how to feel about it. The document was 3 pages, printed on plain paper. It was a summary. I could see it had been copied from something longer. It outlined the estimated value of my estate, the Lorne Street house, the pension, the registered accounts. It had notes about timing specifically, notes about what would happen to those assets in probate if I were to pass without updating certain beneficiary designations. There was a handwritten note in the margin that I read twice before I was sure I had read it correctly. It said, Helen C. find out how to contest. Gerald likely won't update. Helen C. was my lawyer. I put the pages back in the folder. I put the folder back on the shelf. I moved the boxes to the basement. I had 2 cups of coffee with my daughter, and I drove home to Sudbury in the dark. I did not call anyone that night. I sat in Patricia's chair in the living room, the good one, the armchair. By the window she always claimed was hers, and I thought for a long time. I am the kind of man who needs to understand a thing fully before he acts on it. I was not going to react out of fear or out of hurt. I was going to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Over the next 3 weeks, I began to pay attention in the way I had stopped allowing myself to pay attention. I called Helen Chartrand, not about Daniel, not yet. I called on the pretext of wanting to review my will. I said I was thinking about adding a charitable donation, which was true, and I asked about the beneficiary designations on my accounts. Helen walked me through everything. At the end of the call, I said, almost as an afterthought, "Has anyone contacted your office on my behalf recently?" Family, I mean. There was a pause, brief, but present. Helen said that someone had called about 2 months ago, a man who said he was my son-in-law, and that I had asked him to gather some preliminary information. She said her office had declined to discuss any details, but had confirmed I was a client. She said she had meant to mention it to me at our next meeting. I thanked her, and I sat with that for a day. Then I called a retired colleague of mine named Robert Thill, who had spent the last decade of his career working with the Ontario government on land fraud cases before he retired to his property outside of Huntsville. Robert is 71 years old. He chops his own wood, and he has exactly 0 patience for people who try to take things that don't belong to them. I told him what I had found. I read him the handwritten note from memory. I had photographed every page of that document with my phone before I put it back on the shelf. Robert listened without interrupting, which is something he is very good at. When I finished, he said, "Gerald, that note is not nothing. That is someone mapping a timeline around your death." He said, "You need to find out what he's already done, not just what he's planning." That was the question I hadn't let myself ask clearly. Not what was Daniel planning, but what had he already done? I drove back to Barrie on a Tuesday morning when I knew both Renee and Daniel would be at work. I used the spare key my daughter had given me 3 years ago when she said, In case of emergency, Dad. I had never used it before. I am not the kind of man who enters his daughter's home without asking. I want you to understand that what I did next was not something I did lightly. I stood at that front door for a full 5 minutes before I used the key. I went directly to Daniel's home office, which was a room off the main hallway that he kept locked when guests were over. It was not locked that morning. Inside, on his desk, there was a second laptop, not the one he used openly. A different one, older, which I had never seen before. I did not open it. But on the desk beside it was a printed email thread, partially obscured under a coffee mug, but visible along the right side. I moved the mug. I read it. The email thread was between Daniel and someone named T. Marchetti, whom I did not recognize. The most recent email, from Daniel, said that the timeline had been pushed back because, as he put it, the old man seems to have gotten more active lately, and we need the story to be cleaner. T. Marchetti's reply said, "We need updated beneficiary confirmation before we move. Get access or we can't proceed." I photographed that too. I put the mug back exactly as I had found it, and I left the house, and I sat in my truck at the end of the street for 20 minutes. I am 63 years old, and I have lived a quiet life, and I have never in that life felt the particular sensation of understanding that the people closest to you have been calculating your death like a project schedule. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that truck. I did not feel angry, not primarily. I felt a grief so heavy and so sudden that it pressed on my chest like a physical weight, not for myself, but for Renee. Because whatever Daniel was, and whatever he had done, my daughter had loved this man. My daughter had built her life inside this plan without knowing it was a plan. And that grief, that particular grief, is the thing that determined every decision I made in the weeks that followed. I did not confront Daniel. I did not call Renee. I went home to Sudbury and I made 2 cups of tea, and I called Helen Chartrand and I told her everything. Helen is a measured woman. She has been practicing law for over 30 years, and she has, as she put it to me that afternoon, seen most of what people are capable of. She listened carefully. She asked me to send her the photographs I had taken. She said nothing for a long moment after she'd had time to look at them, and then she said, "Gerald, I want you to come in tomorrow morning, and I want you to bring Robert if he'll come. Because what this says to me is that there is someone named T. Marchetti who is likely connected to a fraudulent document service, and Daniel has been working toward a contested will scenario, meaning he intends to challenge your will after you pass, on grounds that are almost certainly fabricated." She said, "He needs you to die, Gerald, and he needs it to happen before you can update your documents. I am going to tell you something that surprises people when I say it." Hearing that said out loud, directly, by a woman I trust, it did not break me. It clarified me. There is a difference. I have sat with enough loss in my life to know that clarity is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in something terrible. I knew, in that moment, exactly what I needed to do. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I needed to protect. Over the following 2 months, Helen and I worked carefully. I updated my will not in the way Daniel was expecting, not a simple change of beneficiary that he might somehow intercept. Helen structured the documents with a level of complexity that I will not fully detail here. But the short version is this. The house on Lawrence Street, my pension, and my registered accounts were placed into a trust, administered jointly by Helen's firm and Robert Thill, with Renee as the sole beneficiary. The trust was designed so that it could not be contested on any of the grounds Daniel's email thread had flagged as his intended strategy. Helen also made contact, through appropriate channels, with a colleague of hers at the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit. I want to be clear. This was not about revenge. That is not who I am. This was about making sure that what Patricia and I had built over a lifetime, the house she loved, the savings we had been careful with, the small, decent estate of 2 ordinary people who worked hard and asked for nothing, would go where it was meant to go, and nowhere else. The OPP investigation that followed took 6 weeks. I will not go into everything they found, because some of it is still before the courts, and I have been asked not to discuss specifics. What I can tell you is that T. Marchetti turned out to be connected to a document preparation service in Mississauga that had been under investigation for an unrelated matter for over a year. What I can tell you is that the second laptop in Daniel's office contained correspondence that the investigators found very interesting. What I can tell you is that Daniel was not the first elderly parent of a spouse that T. Marchetti had been involved with. The morning the investigators went to the house in Barrie, I called Renee first. That was the hardest phone call of my life. Not the years of Patricia's illness, not the morning she died, not any of the losses that had come before this was the hardest, because this was the moment I had to look at my daughter across the distance of a telephone line and tell her that the man she had married had been planning around her father's death. I told her calmly. I told her with as much gentleness as I could hold together. I told her everything I knew, in the order I had learned it, without editorializing, the way I would tell it to anyone I respected. She was silent for a very long time. And then she said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I told her, 2 months. She was quiet again. And then she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I needed to make sure you would never have to be afraid. I needed to make sure everything was already safe before I put this on you." She cried for a long time after that. I stayed on the phone. There is nothing you can say in a moment like that, so I did not try to say anything. I just stayed on the line and I let her know she was not alone in it. Daniel was charged that November. I will not name the specific charges because, as I said, the matter is still before the courts. He and Renee separated shortly after. She is living in Kingston now, close to some friends she has had since university. She calls me every Sunday. She comes to Sudbury for every long weekend, and she sits in Patricia's chair in the living room, and sometimes we just sit there together without talking, which is its own kind of healing. I want to say something to anyone watching this who is in a season of life where you are beginning to feel invisible, where the people around you have started to treat your age like a countdown. I want to say this clearly. Experience is not a weakness. A lifetime of paying attention is not something that disappears because someone decides to stop seeing you. I am 63 years old, and I worked for 32 years in the field, and I raised my daughter, and I loved my wife, and I have stood on the edge of more lakes and rivers and forests in northern Ontario than I can count. I know how to read what is in front of me. I know when something is wrong. Do not let anyone make you feel like you have stopped being capable of protecting what you love. You have not. You are not. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I will stop. 3 weeks after Daniel was charged, I went back to the garage in Barrie to help Renee pack her things. On my way out, I passed the shelving unit where I had found that file folder 2 months before. The folder was gone. In its place, neatly labeled in Daniel's handwriting, was an empty slot where it had been. He had moved it. At some point between October and November, he had moved it, probably because he knew he'd left it somewhere visible. But he'd moved it too late. The land tells you the truth, even when the people standing on it don't. I picked up one of Renee's boxes, and I carried it out to the truck, and I did not look back. If this story stayed with you, if you have a parent, or you are a parent, or you simply know what it means to protect something you love, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you're new here, this is Shattered Vengeance Real Stories, Real People, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. Subscribe and stay close, because there is always more to tell.